Good morning here at the Press Club Concordia in the heart of Vienna and online. My name is Daniela Kraus. I'm the General Secretary of the Press Club. For all of you who don't know us, we are one of the oldest press clubs in the world, maybe the oldest, dating back to 1859. And I read in our chronics, and I saw that there was an event in the 70s where we were informed about the Paya Weibrecht expedition to the North Pole. So it's not the first time that we deal with the topic of the Arctic. However, I'm definitely not an expert, but I'm very happy that we have this series of events that are authored by Mirjana Tomic. Good morning, Mirjana. And some of you know our series. It's a European context, and it's always about geopolitics, politics, and sometimes also about the media, which is what we are dealing here mainly. This is a cooperation between Erste Foundation, thank you very much, between Europe's Futures of IWM and FIUM, Forum for Journalism and Media, which is a training institution in Vienna. So I say thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you, but in particular to our speakers for coming to Vienna. And thank you to our partners. And I hand over to Ivan Vejvoda, the director of Europe's Futures. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you to Press Club Concordia for hosting us on these events. It's a real pleasure to have the cooperation of the institutions that were mentioned, and I will also thank the Erste Stiftung for their generous support for this event and for this series of programs. As Daniela said, we try and focus on broad issues in the current political situation where obviously all media attention is on two huge conflicts. The second sad anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and of course, what's happening in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine at loggerheads. We try to point the light at an issue that is unfortunately not in the eye of people, and yet, as you will see today, and Mirjana Tomic, our colleague who has done all the groundwork and assiduously prepared this event, will describe why we are actually looking at this cold subject of the North Pole. So I hand it over to Mirjana, and thank you all for being here.
Good morning. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I'm the author of different seminar series for media and academia, focusing on politics and media in Europe. I have to tell you, Ivan, that the fact that we know little about the Arctic is not because of the lack of information. There is lots of information. In fact, as I was preparing for this event, I was surprised how much the information there is around. But it is scattered, and it doesn't give a big picture of how different phenomena and developments are related. Climate, economy, geopolitical struggle. I have the feeling, and I may be wrong, I'm not an Arctic expert, that scientists and political scientists, natural scientists, and people in social sciences, they all deal with one small aspect when you really have to understand the whole picture. You cannot only deal with one aspect. Then I was thinking, why is it not so near to us now that the Arctic is treated like El Dorado? It is, there is a grab for minerals and for all the riches. Both Russia and the United States, not at the same time, planted small flags at the bottom of the ocean to claim or to try to claim how far they can explore the Arctic, and it is far beyond their borders. The Arctic is huge. I think we don't even understand how big is the Arctic in Russia. And that Ksenia will explain. Only Yakutia is like half of Europe or bigger, one of the Arctic provinces. So I was thinking, is it about distance? Well, no. because from Vienna to Svalbard or Spitsberg, it is 3,300 kilometers, and from Vienna to New York, it's 6,900. And we know quite a bit about New York, and we really don't know in this part of Europe much about the Arctic. Is it about timing? I realized when speaking to our colleague from Iceland that scientists have different timing. They speak of 50 years, 100 years, and we political analysts think of elections, but nature doesn't think about elections. And everything that happens in the Arctic is connected. As we know, and we have all read somewhere, it heats up 3 times to 7 times faster than the rest of the planet. And the changes are enormous. What does it mean in practical terms? The experts will explain. It means in practical terms that some months, and it will be rather soon, there will be no ice in the Arctic. So it is for the grabs. New commercial routes. How it will affect fishing, I don't know. Then we are having a new phenomenon, which is deep sea mining. Norway wants to mine 4,000 meters in the sea. What will be the consequences? No one is quite sure. Who does it all belong to? I hope Rasmus explains it a little bit, but as I was doing all this reading, I'm not really sure it is all very clear who is there for the grabs. So Arctic is about minerals, about cables, about pipelines. Everything is up in the north. It is not only white bears or white foxes that is our traditional image. So I would like to thank our 4 speakers that are coming from afar. Well, one is not coming so much from afar. We have 2 professors from Tromsø, University of North Norway. We have an environmental activist from Russia currently living in Bulgaria, not so much in the north. Ksenia, and we have Toli. I have to use her nickname because pronouncing her name is a bit of a challenge, who is an expert on climate change, glaciers, and who will explain to us how the changes will affect us all, because it is not about what happens in the Arctic, that it stays there. It doesn't. It will affect all of us. There is even a theory, I don't know if it is true or not, that climate changes in the Arctic might affect geopolitical struggle for the Arctic and may mean Russian supremacy in the Arctic. Russia owns 53% of the Arctic, so can profit more from melting ice. So it would be logical, but we are not going to do it like that we start with climate changes, economy, and then geopolitics. Unfortunately, Rasmus has to leave at 12. So we are starting with the economy from the Western perspective, from the Russian perspective. Then we shall deal with climate, and finally with new partners or new interests in the Arctic. Let me just say which are the countries that are part of the Arctic Council. So which are the main 8 countries, but they are not the only ones who are there. That is United States, Canada, Iceland, Greenland, that is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, Russian Federation, Sweden, Norway, and I'm missing someone, Finland, yes. So it is 8 countries. And we have 2 speakers who will address economy and the impact on the environment. That is Rasmus Bertelsen, professor of Northern Studies, Barents Chair in Politics at the Arctic University of Norway. This is in Tromsø. And also Nansen Professor of Arctic Studies at the University of Akureyri in Iceland, sorry. His research focuses on Arctic international relations, international political economy, international security, science diplomacy, geopolitics, geoeconomic, geostrategy, technology, international affairs. There is a QR there, you can see the full CVs of all our speakers. And our second speaker this morning, and the first panel, Ksenia Vakhrusheva. She's from St. Petersburg, economist and engineer, and environmental activist. She also was briefly a politician for the Liberal Party, Jabloko. But she had to leave Russia in 2014 because now that we are all familiar with the concept of foreign agent, it all actually started in 2012, so it's not that recent. And from what I understand, environmental activists were among the first to be attacked. Ksenia has worked and works for Bellona Foundation that deals with an independent international nonprofit organization based in Oslo. It used to have 2 offices in Russia. It no longer does. And Ksenia will explain Russian projects for the Arctic. There are a lot of them. They are huge, and we are not quite sure what the environmental consequences will be. Thank you for being with us, and I hope we all learn something today about the part of the world that is very near. And just as an anecdote, and I think it fits the title of all our series is, when I was talking to the speakers and we were organizing their trips, except for Ksenia, everyone referred to coming to Europe, like continental Europe. Now I'm coming to Europe, so I'll combine a few trips. And I thought they were all parts of Europe. But at the same time, in Spain, the country I know so well, very often people would say, oh, it's a European tradition. Well, I just hope that Vienna is Europe, that we are all Europe, and welcome to Vienna. And I hope we all learn a lot this morning. Thank you. Please. Rasmus. There is a clock there.
Yeah. Yes, good morning, everybody, and it seems like the sound is working. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's very good to be able to share discussions about the Arctic with audience here. Very good to meet and discuss with good colleagues. So I have already been introduced, so I will dive right into what I want to talk about. But before I start my presentation, I just want to point out some discourses about the Arctic, which are very common, and I think we should be careful about because they may not be valid, and I think they can be poor guides for strategy and policy. The one thing to be very cautious about is to see climate change as the only cause of change or a factor in isolation. And what I will emphasize is how climate change interacts with other factors. And I think that's perhaps one of the most important things you can take away from my presentation. It is not to look at climate change as a single factor, but interacting with other factors. Another term you hear very often is Arctic exceptionalism, that the Arctic somehow was apart from or operating according to different rules than international relations in general. Personally, I don't think that's valid. I don't think it's correct, and I think it's a very poor guide for policy. In my view, the Arctic, historically, today, and in the future, is closely integrated into international relations, and it very much reflects international relations. I think the sound is very high. I hear myself almost echoing. Okay, good. Then I think we should also be very cautious about presentism. In social sciences, and I'm a political scientist, in social sciences, we often have a very short historical horizon, and we have a very bad habit that everything was discovered or invented or started yesterday. And the same with the Arctic. There's a lot of talk about rising interest in the Arctic as if it was forgotten and hidden before. This picture here, it doesn't really show on the screen. This picture, and Vejprecht, and has been mentioned, that is from the old churchyard in Tromsø. I live next to it. The gentleman is Per Helge Nylund from the Tromsø University Museum. And the gravestone is for Captain Elling Carlsen, 1819-1900, a Tromsø captain who was the ice pilot for Vejprecht and his expeditions. There is a very long there's a very long interest in the Arctic. There's a very long political, economic, scientific, security interest in the Arctic. End of history. We all remember here the 1990s when the United States had won the Cold War, the Soviet Union had lost it, and that was supposed to be the end of history. Well, history doesn't exactly end the way we wanted it to end, and we should also be very wary of such end of history thinking for the Arctic. We have a very bad habit of talking about unpredictable opponents. Basically, I think for example, Russia is behaving quite predictably, that we call opponents unpredictable when we don't want to recognize their logics of behavior. And finally, talking about geopolitical instability, which I think again is because we are operating with the wrong theories or the wrong assumptions. That with valid theories, with valid assumptions, things are fairly predictable and stable. And finally, to be aware of wishful thinking. I think there's been, and I think there continues to be, a good deal of wishful thinking in Western policymaking, which brings us into a lot of trouble. Very briefly about my own background. I am a Danish national, but I grew up in Iceland, which very much founds my interest in the Arctic. It's, of course, me on an Icelandic horse in the mid-1980s. The very stately woman next to me was Vilborg Dagbjörnsdóttir, a teacher of mine and a very important Icelandic poet, who, her and her late husband, Þorgeir Þorgeirsson, journalist and filmmaker, influenced me very much. And the last picture, you see me with the former president of Iceland and the director general of the Chinese Polar Research Institute, Dr. Yang Huigin, at the inauguration of the China-Iceland Arctic Observatory some years ago. And that's very much, how to say, my trajectory. The Icelanders have a very strong tradition of traveling for education, which in Icelandic is called a sigla, or simply to sail. And that's something that has influenced me very much, and that is very much what I am and what has shaped my thinking. So when you listen to me and you wonder why I see the world the way I see it, it's very much because of that background. So looking at the big picture of the Arctic, and again, back to what I was saying about we should be very cautious about looking at the climate change as an explanatory factor in isolation. I think that for looking at the Arctic, it's very useful to look at the interplay of three things: international order, and again, be very wary of Arctic exceptionalism, because the Arctic, historically today and in the future, closely reflects international order. So when we had Cold War bipolarity, we had a bipolar Arctic. When we had post-Cold War US unipolarity and hegemony, we had the circumpolar liberal Arctic order with the Arctic Council and a lot of collaboration with Russia. That was not exceptional. It simply reflected unipolarity. And that unipolarity, of course, is coming to an end. Now we have an international order splitting up between a US-led NATO plus world, NATO plus Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, and what you could call a BRICS plus world, where, of course, China is the biggest actor. And we see that very clearly in the Arctic. The Arctic is divided between the NATO Arctic and the Russian Arctic, where, of course, Russia is reaching out to the BRICS world. Then we have science and technology, where especially technology of the day decides which Arctic resources are in demand for the world economy. In the 1600s, it was whale oil. In the 20th century, it was oil and gas. And the future, it's very much rare earth elements. So it's the state of technology that decides which Arctic natural resources are in demand. And then finally, we have geography. And of course, geography usually doesn't change on a time scale relevant to human life. But it does in this case because of climate change. And it is a question of sea ice change. It is that is happening so rapidly, and I look forward to listening to Professor Guðfinna Aðalgeirsdóttir talking about the cryosphere changes. But here it's a question of that geography is changing because of climate change. And here you have a map of the Arctic, but you have that with you. Okay, so we look very quickly at changes to the world around us. And we are living through very dramatic changes. Of course, one fundamental factor is demographics. And when you look at that distribution of world population, where of course we see the two giants, India and China, and we see how small the West is, something we forget very much in the West. We forget that we are a very small minority of humanity. And of course, as the rest gets richer, more advanced in science and technology, that changes the world very much, and it also changes the Arctic. So Asia is returning to its long-term historical position as the center of the world economy. We see here the shift between the G7 and the BRICS, but we also see that, of course, the BRICS countries are relatively so much poorer, and the large population times economic development and scientific development gives a huge effect. We see it when it comes to science and technology. I don't want to go into the details here. These are National Science Foundation, US National Science Foundation data on science and engineering papers, which of course shows that basically the BRICS countries are growing very rapidly in the quantity of publications and also the quality of publications. And then finally, we have global changes in legitimacy, which is very clear now concerning international law and around the violence in Gaza. So these are the global changes that also very much affect the Arctic. That is the context for what is going on in the Arctic now. And then when we look at climate change, and I said, what climate change does with the Arctic and for economic opportunities, Professor Guðfinna Aðalgeirsdóttir will, I think, talk more about the environment. It is changing the geography. And here you see this map of possible shipping routes, where of course there are the historical Northeast Passage north of Russia and the historical Northwest Passage north of Canada. The Northwest Passage north of Canada, it's much less accessible than the Northeast Passage north of Russia, and it's simply much less relevant and much less valuable. I mean, what is interesting, what is valuable is the Northeast Passage north of Russia, or in the Russian formulation, the Northern Sea Route. And basically, if you see here, what is interesting is the light blue area, these markers, they don't work with those screens. But the light blue area you see in the middle, that's the summer ice. That's the minimum ice extent, which is decreasing rapidly. But you will see the gray areas, that's the winter ice extent. And of course, because of cold, because of darkness, the winter ice is much less affected than the summer ice. But you can see that in the summer, early autumn, you have a lot of open water or much more navigable water, especially north of Russia. And as Mirjana Tomic pointed out, about half the Arctic is Russia. And in my view, the Russian half of the Arctic is economically more valuable than the NATO half of the Arctic. I also suspect it might be scientifically more valuable, especially because of the permafrost. And there, back to what I was saying about not thinking in monocausal ways, not thinking about that climate change is the only thing happening. And the reason why I emphasize these global changes, demographic, economic, scientifically, is that in Russia, you have a lot of energy, you have a lot of natural resources, and then you have a world economy, not least a non-Western world economy, very much demanding those natural resources and that energy. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that in a moment. You see this map here from the United States Geological Survey. Mirjana, do I understand correctly? I have about 10 minutes left. Okay. So this study here from the United States Geological Survey, some years ago, I think it was 2008, it got a lot of attention, showing how much possible oil and gas there was north of the Arctic Circle. That map is not easy to read if you're not very used to the Arctic. It's of course a North Pole projection of the world. You have the North Pole in the middle. The only feature that's easy to recognize is Greenland in the 130 corner of the picture. And of course, the darkest blue color is there you have 100% probability of oil and gas. You will see that there is some north of Alaska. That's of course Alaska North Slope, which is an important oil production area for the United States. But you will see that the largest dark blue areas are very much in the Barents Sea and northern Russia. So you see very clearly that there are very rich natural resources in that area, and you just saw the map of the sea ice reductions, which means that those resources become accessible. Then there's a lot of talk about possible conflicts in the Arctic, and there we should be very, very careful. There has been a lot of talk about possible natural resource conflicts in the Arctic. There's been plenty of conflict in the Arctic. For example, during the Second World War, very heavy fighting on the Kola Peninsula and the areas around. But these are never conflicts that originate in the Arctic. It's always outside great power conflicts that spread to the Arctic. And the Arctic is quite well defined in terms of international law. My colleague, Professor Christopher Rossi, may speak more about that. But basically here you see that, of course, the Arctic is surrounded by 8 sovereign states with no border disputes. The Kingdom of Denmark and Canada recently settled a dispute about an uninhabited island between Greenland and Canada. There is a maritime dispute between Canada and the United States, but those are the only disputes. You have very clear exclusive economic zones, you have clear continental shelves, and if you remember the map I showed you a moment ago, that those very rich mineral resources are clearly on either national territory or exclusive economic zones. So that's not a cause for concern. Here, again, those maps are slightly overlapping, but again, you will see that energy resources and also mineral resources, mining resources, you see where they're concentrated, northwest Russia, Alaska, some northern Scandinavia, and of course what we see in northern Scandinavia now, because of for international political reasons, where the West has become so concerned about supply chains. The West is so concerned about securing its critical minerals, etc. We used to outsource mining to the rest of the world. Mining is very, very polluting. It's socially and culturally very disruptive. But we could outsource those problems to the rest of the world. We don't dare to do that anymore. Now we're bringing it back, which means a lot more pressure on Arctic societies, local societies, indigenous societies, to take on the environmental, social, and cultural disruption from mining activities. But again, it's the interplay between climate change and not least changes to international order. This is, how to say, the good old days before Crimea annexation, before Ukraine invasion. It's an enormous Russian liquefied natural gas project, Yamal. I think it was a $27 billion investment, something like that. And you can see how it's the combination of natural resources, of now navigable routes because of changes to sea ice, and bringing to not least East Asian markets. And of course, these projects are heavily affected by sanctions, first after 2014, and now very much from 2022. And what we are seeing here is, of course, Western capital, Western technology is being replaced by Chinese capital and Chinese technology. There's another LNG project next door, the Arctic LNG 2 project, where I was just reading up on that it was first hit by EU sanctions on technology. Now the technology is somewhat replaced by Chinese technology, and now the United States is trying to kill that project by the threat of secondary sanctions to anybody buying LNG from there. Okay, then our host brought up the topic of deep sea mining, and again, it's all the interplay between technology, international politics, and resources. So the mineral resources that the Western economies need very much, and we could, I think, easily source globally if we were willing to accept vulnerable supply lines and supply chains. And we are, for political reasons, we don't tolerate those vulnerabilities anymore. So we are looking for other places to source these resources. And there, the seabed is one such place. And Norway is moving quite quickly ahead, with some studies or licenses, I don't know, remember the details exactly, in the area you see marked there. Personally, and many people have been surprised and upset with Norway for going forward with that. I think one of the reasons why Norway is going forward with that is the Norwegian economy. Norway is, of course, a very highly developed Nordic welfare state, but it is very much an extractive economy. It's a natural resource-based economy. It's not an industrial economy as the Swedish economy or a service economy as the Danish economy. One of the few areas where Norway is very strong is in offshore technology. And I think Norway basically wants to be a first mover in deep sea mining technology. And then you have the International Seabed Authority under the United Nations, which grants the licenses for mining in the beyond exclusive economic zones and beyond established continental shelves. And the law of the sea around this is, I think, very well established, and actually the only major power which stands outside that is the United States, which has not ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So to conclude, to think about climate change, new economic opportunities, and the implications for the environment, I would encourage you all to think in terms of this interaction between international order, where the international order, this NATO plus, BRICS plus divided world we are moving into, it puts a lot of pressure on supply chains for the West, securing that puts a lot of pressure on some Arctic communities, some Arctic environments. What is the state of science and technology? What kind of natural resources are we demanding now? Increasingly critical minerals for green transition. And finally, where climate change does play a factor is in changing the geography, especially concerning sea ice. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We shall have Q&A. I will now ask Ksenia to give a presentation on Russian investments in the Arctic and their environmental impact. It will be 20 minutes, and then we shall have half an hour Q&A, and you can ask both of our speakers.
Thank you, Mirjana. Good morning, everybody, here in the audience and online. It's my great pleasure to participate in this event with such honored professors. I'm not a professor myself, and I'm not coming from academic sphere, although I had a couple of years teaching in one of the Russian universities. But now I'm fully an NGO person, working for more than 10 years with the Bellona Foundation, first in Russia, and now remotely with the team in Lithuania. But as Mirjana said, I'm located in Bulgaria for political, personal reasons. First, briefly about Bellona, but Mirjana already presented the organization, so I wouldn't go into details. I just want to point out that we have offices not only in Oslo, where the organization was founded in 1986, but we also have almost 30 years office in Brussels, working with the EU affairs. Now office in Berlin, and now in Lithuania as well, which was founded last year as a consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because we had to relocate people who worked in Russia in Murmansk and St. Petersburg somewhere outside. We decided to close up offices right after the beginning of the invasion, because we worked in Russia for almost 30 years, since early 90s, focusing on nuclear safety, industrial pollution, environmental rights, environmental education. We worked with both civil society closely, with sometimes with the authorities. We tried to work with authorities. But after the invasion, it became senseless to work with the authorities and business, because it's ethically inappropriate and also dangerous for people who work there. So we closed offices and relocated people who wanted to continue work for us. But it didn't save us from blaming as undesirable organization last year. So Bellona Foundation now is undesirable, and all people who are Russian nationals working for it are conducting criminal offense. Anyway, we continue working with Russian issues because Russia is huge. The environmental impact of Russia on global pollution and climate change is also quite significant. And we need to be aware what kind of risks are coming from there, what are potential risks that can be driven from there. And since we have this a little bit of expertise in this sphere, we decided to continue the research and more go into analytical work because we cannot work on the ground anymore right now and for unknown amount of years. Of course, our long-term goal is to come back to Russia and work on the ground with civil society, with environmental rights there. But with the current war, it's not predictable when it will be possible again. So coming back to the topic of what is Russian Arctic and what the Arctic means for Russian authorities and Russia. Here are some brief statistics. The Arctic part of Russia, it's roughly a quarter of the Arctic land, and for Russia it means like 28% of Russian land. Of course, it depends how you count, but we count usually not along the 60 parallel, the North Pole, from the North Pole, but for the regions that are officially by law included in the Russian law as the Arctic zone of Russia. It doesn't reflect some of the scientific concepts, but I will explain later why it's done by that. It's 7 to 10% of GDP of Russia, 83% of natural gas is extracted there, 17% of oil, almost all diamonds are extracted there, 90% of nickel and cobalt, and some other platinum group metals, 60% of copper. It's, of course, Northern Sea route, which is orange there, and important military base and military the weapon test sites, which were historically on Novaya Zemlya archipelago, and still continue, and we see some signs of activity, new activities there. So how do Russian authorities see the Arctic? And for them, if you see the documents like the strategy of the Arctic, the economic and social economic policy of the Arctic, different strategic documents that were adopted recently, like in previous 5 years, it's always stated that it's a great economic opportunity for Russia. It's new mining sites for oil, gas, and metals. It's also a special economic zone. And here I explain why they include some more and more municipalities in the Arctic zone, because the whole Arctic zone in Russia is the special economic zone with reduced taxes for companies who are registered there and operating there. It's significantly reduced income tax. It's a very easy procedure to obtain land without tender procedures. It's also some parts you don't have to pay the export fee or import fee. So this is very easy. Easy to register a company, easy to get the land to mine, and you don't need to pay that much taxes. And also, it means that your economic activity will be limited by, won't be limited by environmental control, because the environmental control mechanisms, they are reduced in this special economic zone. That's why they try to now expand the Arctic zone even more, to include some more places where some natural resources are situated, to let companies mine more without bureaucratic and environmental obstacles. Of course, the old Russian dream is to have the dominance in international shipping. Rasmus already talked about that, and their all year round sailing across the Northern Sea route is old dream of Russian authorities. They're trying to implement it, but still it's not yet possible, even with the current climate change developments, because not only the fact that the ice melts and allows this open water route be used by ships without icebreakers, but still climate change is not only rising temperature, it's also rising severe weather conditions. And together with the melting ice, the waves are coming bigger and bigger, and the erosion of the seashore is becoming bigger. And then it's not that easy still to sail in these waters. So it's not that definite that just with climate change, this Northern Sea route will become available. A lot of obstacles are there, and also the technological obstacles that there are a lack of icebreakers, even though Russia is trying to build more and more, and I will show you their plans for that. But also there is not so many ports along the sea route, no established system of accident prevention, monitoring, bunkering for fuel, and so on. It's not yet constructed there. There are some plans, but they're very difficult to implement due to severe weather conditions, lack of money, which goes now all to the war, and lack of technology, lack of Western technology because of the sanctions. So it's also a military base and a weapon test site. As I said earlier, that Arctic used to be a nuclear test site for Soviet Union, and now they're using this archipelago still as a military base and test site for some non-nuclear weapon. At least for now, it's considered that they use it for non-nuclear weapon tests. Russia created a special Arctic military force and established around 7 new military bases along the Arctic coast. And also, natural habitat for Arctic species and indigenous population. It's also always mentioned in the documents, because on the international arena, it's very important to mention the environmental consequences, that they care for environment, they care for Arctic species, they care for indigenous populations. But if you dig more, you see that this part is very limited in description and with no targets. If, for example, for the economic development, there are some targets, then for the nature conservation, not so definite. That's why it's gray and not clear in this slide. To understand the environmental consequences, I will just briefly explain the history, because some of the Russian Arctic territory is already heavily polluted, and it's not dealt with. Here are just examples of 4 sites with severe pollution, with historical severe pollution. And it's already polluted, but the industries continue to work there and continue to pollute. It's first one is Norilsk, it's on the eastern part. Here is the mining of nickel and cobalt and copper. It's it's the biggest polluter in the Russian Arctic and in Russia itself. So it's just to understand, it emits 10% of all emissions from stationary sources in Russia. Just one enterprise. And it started in 1953. So another one is in Murmansk regions. It's also mining of copper, nickel, cobalt, and other minerals. Also belongs to Norilsk Nickel, the biggest company who owns all nickel production in Russia. Started in 1930. Very polluted region. Around the plants and mining sites, 40 kilometers around, there is no vegetation. Not much is done to restore this area. Then, since the 1980s, there is a Usinsk district with a lot of oil extraction going on. Oil extraction in Russia is also associated with a lot of pollution because especially connected with oil pipes. Oil pipes system is quite developed, but not maintained properly. And I would say that according to, and there is no reliable statistics on how many oil and how many leaks there are. But there are some calculations that there can be every half an hour there is an oil leak in Russia. Vorkuta region with coal mining as well. Then Mariana said that I have only 5 minutes. So nuclear waste legacy, that's also connected with the nuclear military activities of the Soviet Union. But the thing is that there were a lot of objects which were sunken or in the Arctic waters, and they're still there. Some of them are still, one submarine is still with highly enriched uranium there, and no one knows how to take it out to dispose safely. Before the war, there were plans, and Vilona was part of that, to work closely with Rosatom and international states to raise this question, to help Russia to work with this nuclear legacy and to put it in a safe state. But of course, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all those projects stopped, and now Russia doesn't have not the intention, not the money, not the necessary technology to continue this work. Yeah, that's main environmental consequences, which I already pointed out. So this is the map of Russia and Russian most polluted enterprises, most polluted sites. There are 300 of enterprises which are considered most polluted. 30 of them are situated in the Arctic region. The red zone is the Arctic region as of now. It's mostly oil and gas and metal production. Here is some statistics about the emissions of these sites, and all the 30 companies which emit the most, they're from 9 owners, 9 companies. Not all of them are sanctioned yet. For example, Norilsk Nickel is not under sanctions at all, and the European Union is still buying nickel from these enterprises, which emit enormous amount of sulfur oxide. Just to compare, that all of Alaska's polluting emissions are more than 8 times less than just what emit Norilsk Nickel and Gazprom. Also, if you calculate the Canadian emissions from industrial sources in the Arctic zone, it's 57 times less than just one Norilsk Nickel. So this is enormous amounts of emissions, both polluting emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, because that's different.
Companies.
Yes, and European Union buys from Norilsk Nickel. Well, not so much from Gazprom, because Europe stopped buying pipe gas. They just buy now LNG from Yamal project because of the long-term contracts, which they cannot and don't want to stop. Well, fortunately, they stopped buying coal and ferrous metals, which also pollute a lot. But Russian companies managed mostly to switch the export to the eastern part, so India and China. So the development plans. Russia plans to develop the shipping along the Northern Sea route, and as of now, last year, there were 36 million tons of cargo delivered by the Northern Sea route, but they want to achieve it like to 90 million ton in 2004, so this year, which sounds a bit unrealistic in the current circumstances. They, of course, wanted to achieve that due to this huge projects of Arctic LNG 2 plant, the second plant producing LNG, but which will give alone 20 million ton of LNG. So almost double the current, plus 50% of what is now. Whether they succeeded or not depends on the US sanctions, because right now they cannot sell the production, the LNG produced from the Arctic LNG 2 project, because they managed to supplement the technology and start the production line in December last year. But for now, they still didn't manage to find buyers for that. Chinese companies, 2 Chinese companies and Japanese company who were part of the project and invested some money into this project and had the long-term contracts with Russia to buy it. They were concerned about the US sanctions, and they asked the US for exceptions so that they can ship this LNG. But as of now, as far as I know, they still didn't get a reply, so they put it on hold and wait. And now Russia is trying to sell it on the open market and with unknown consequences. We'll see what will happen later in this year, because otherwise it will be very difficult for Russia to ship it somewhere to deal with it, because for internal use, Russia doesn't need that much LNG, and there is no infrastructure to put it in the Russian economy. Arctic shipbuilding, Russia, a couple of years ago, they established another shipbuilding company with intention to have all ships built going around Arctic, built in Russia, built with Russian technology, and going on the Russian flag, under the Russian flag. Right now, it's going very difficult because of the sanctions and the lack of Western technology. But we'll see. Their plan is to build 8 new nuclear icebreakers, 4 new non-nuclear icebreakers, and some other vessels by 2030. Oil extraction, that's also some plans for developing oil extractions there. But the thing is that they don't put targets on how much they will extract because they consider it as a secret information, and after the invasion they stopped publishing daily oil production and any statistics regarding the oil extraction. But we know that there are some new projects, especially Vostok Oil by Rosneft, that's the huge one, which is going very difficult, but they plan to start production this year. Gas extraction, also some plans, mining, and then some kind of things that are not targeted well, like permafrost monitoring system. They want to establish it finally this in the coming years, because they also understand that it's a danger for all infrastructure and all cities that are built on permafrost. Plans to adopt adaptation plans for all the Arctic regions, minimization of emissions and discharges, but no targets. Let's see how what they create by December this year. And migration. The Arctic region, even if Russia wants to develop it so much and puts all the efforts, legislative and economic, to let it develop and invite people there, the population is declining, and the target is, you see, by the 2030 to eliminate the decline, at least, not the surplus, but not to have a declining population. Here are some
we have to stop.
Projects. Yeah, I'm not going to go into details. It's just to see how much they want to mine and extract. This is all extraction plans, which already have some goals and some concrete dates. I didn't include here the plans that don't have concrete year when they want to start the production. And of course, that will contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants and water discharges and land demolition. 1 minute, but this is very important. The last thing that I wanted to say, that what also concerns us a lot is that there is no control, public control of what's going on in the Arctic in terms of industry, pollution, and development. Because almost all the independent environmental organizations recently were prosecuted. Like, for example, in the last 2 years, the 5 biggest NGOs were declared undesirable, including us, including Greenpeace, including WWF. They were working in the Arctic also. They were trying to monitor pollution, oil leaks, and so on. And they cannot work in Russia at all. 8 NGOs, which were local NGOs, were declared as foreign agents, so they already also have limited possibilities to influence and to work in Russia. More than 450 episodes of pressure and persecution of environmental activists, criminal cases, fines. This statistics is for whole Russia, but in the Arctic, it's most active regions were Arkhangelsk and Komi in terms of activism, because in other regions there were lack of civil society even before. Like in Norilsk, even though it's very heavily polluted, it was impossible to be independent activists. And also limited information published since 2022. As I said before, that information about oil extraction is considered secret. So other environmental information is also closing more and more. Additional restrictions which some regions adopt also interfere the work of environmental activists, like in Komi. They prohibited use of drones to monitor oil leaks. And environmental and indigenous populations gongos, which are usually created to substitute the independent organizations. Thank you. Ready to answer questions. Thank you.
Well, sorry, I open the floor for questions for either of the speakers. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Martin Vrba. I'm from Czechia, Prague, and I work as a climate and environmental journalist. I have a simple question for Mr. Bertelsen about, you've talked about this area between Greenland and Norway, which is currently in focus of Norway's mining activities. There are supposed to be minerals, rare earth materials. Could you be more specific? What kind of minerals and materials are we talking about? And is there a role for them in the, let's say, new emerging green economy? Thank you.
Now, exactly what minerals were there, it was on the mentioned on the slide I had. I don't know. We can have that slide back. No, okay. So then I must confess that I don't remember exactly what minerals it was. But if you go on, there is an excellent blog about Arctic affairs called Cryopolitics. It's by Dr. Mia Bennett, an American human geographer. And she has some very good information about that. As I said, and I think the main thing I can, it is of course extremely controversial that Norway has taken this step, and many people are very upset with Norway for having taken this step. But my interpretation is that it has to do with the Norwegian general economy being a natural resource-based economy, an extractive economy, and gaining a first mover advantage in this area, because the offshore sector, the traditional oil and gas offshore sector is of course by far the most valuable part of the Norwegian economy. So deep sea mining, seabed mining is the logical next step for that economy. Thank you.
May I ask a very brief question, and then we go. You have an extractive economy in Norway and an extractive economy in Russia. In Russia, everything is pollution, and in Norway, everything is perfect. Am I understanding it correctly, or what is the difference?
I think the great luck of Norwegian society was that when Norway discovered North Sea oil in the late 1960s, Norway was a very well-established nation state, welfare state, rule of law state, liberal democracy. I think when you look at the world in general, for polities to have very large natural resource rents is very challenging. I mean, you talk about the natural resource rent curse. Personally, I don't speak Russian. I don't know Russian society or politics well enough from the inside. And Ksenia can correct me, but I would say the most fundamental aspect of Russian politics and economics and society is that Russia is a natural resource-based economy. And for that, I would be very pessimistic about the political, etc., development of Russian society. So I think the Norwegians were very lucky to have many other things in place before they found oil.
But are they as polluting?
Well, I mean, they're clean at home, but of course, all the oil and gas they export, it's burned somewhere else. So Norway prides itself of having the least emissions in the extraction of oil and gas, but of course that oil and gas is eventually burned somewhere else.
Thank you. Gerd, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Krauchenberg Institute for the Danube region in Central Europe. I have a question on the Russian claims on the so-called, or what it calls Lomonosov Ridge. How would be the political consequences and finally also the economic consequences? Thank you.
Well, Ksenia can probably also say something. I mean, how to say, these questions of demarcating continental shelves are very well set out in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And Russia, the Kingdom of Denmark, and Canada, they have collaborated very well scientifically, diplomatically, about establishing the science, submitting their scientific data to the Continental Shelf Committee of the United Nations. So that's going in a very, how to say, regular way so far. But of course, with the war in Ukraine, the ever poorer relations between Russia and the West, I mean, it's anybody can guess how that's going to go in the future. My personal concern, and as I've said, I'm a Danish national, so of course this concerns the Kingdom of Denmark very much. I mean, the Kingdom of Denmark, north of Greenland, and the Russian Federation have overlapping claims. I mean, if we imagine Russian leadership, which is perhaps losing a war somewhere, let's say Ukraine, which is under intense domestic pressure, and this is pure speculation from my side, but if we imagine a Russian leadership which feels it needs to make some kind of nationalist statement for domestic support, and it makes a unilateral claim, that would mess up the diplomatic processes there very much. I mean, this is pure speculation from my side. So far, everybody follows these UN rules. The only ones who are outside are the United States, who have not ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Thank you. Could you please, yes, just could you read the online question?
Yes, we have one question. Online from Philip Nubel, Global Voices Taiwan. How do you see Russia and China collaborating to use the Arctic as a new channel for transport, linkage of their economies, and possible change in global security? Thanks.
Well, I can start. Well, I mean, I think one triangle that drives international politics these days, it's the United States, Russia, and China. Now, of course, the United States and China have an ever worse relationship. The United States and Russia are de facto in proxy war in Ukraine. And that, of course, affects the third side of that triangle, that China and Russia, they can seek various kinds of relief from their conflicts from the United States and their collaboration, not least in energy. And China, one of China's great challenges is energy security. I think China must be the world's largest energy importer. That energy travels on seas controlled by the United States Navy. So, of course, one way for China to address its energy security concerns and that vulnerability to American blockade, it is to expand their energy collaboration with Russia.
Thank you.
But this is also difficult to establish because China also has a lot of economic connections with the US and it doesn't want to put all the eggs in one pocket. And as we see now with this Arctic LNG2 project, it doesn't want to forget about the US sanctions and just go ahead with cooperation with Russia. They are very careful about all the cooperation. Yes, they provide technology where it's possible. Yes, they will buy all the resources which are not banned by or threatened by secondary sanctions. But it will be very careful with developing the just one state direction cooperation.
Thank you. There was a question here first, and then please go ahead.
Thank you. Laetitia Specinski, Université Catholique de Louvain, Belgium. My country is now the biggest port, I mean, one of the biggest ports for LNG, Russian LNG going into Europe. It's almost competing with the former role of Austria. So I had a question about the LNG 2 project that you mentioned. You said the project is up and running, but they cannot sell the oil, the gas, sorry. And even the Chinese are wary about secondary sanctions, but we keep importing that natural gas, liquefied gas, so why don't we buy the LNG too? We buy a lot of natural gas from the Yamal Peninsula, so why not this one? That's what I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
Yes, there are 2 projects. Yamal LNG project, which started in 2017, and there like 20% of the shares are owned by French Total, and they have long-term contracts to deliver LNG from Yamal to different European countries, mostly Spain, France, and some other, but through Belgium port. The idea was that the Arctic LNG 2 project is a different plant, a different enterprise, although it's owned by the same company, Novatek, in Russia. But the United States established the sanctions just on this concrete project, Arctic LNG 2, not for the whole LNG produced in Russia, but for specific project. That's why technically and legally it's okay to ship LNG from Russia from Yamal LNG, and not okay to ship LNG from Arctic 2.
Go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm Harvey Zoden. It's my first time here, and I'm very happy to have this explanation of another region of the world that's going to be a hotspot soon. So I have questions about rare earths. So you have China that's cultivating rare earths in Africa and elsewhere. You've got Russia with all these deposits. You have the US that is trying to exploit rare earths, maybe not as much as the other 2. So where do rare earths figure into this? Because in this region, there are so many rare earths apparently, and apparently in the Russian section. So I'd like you to discuss this as a possible flashpoint and also for the implications in the near and middle term. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who wants to start?
Well, let me take a first guess and then Ksenia can correct me. My understanding is that rare earth elements are actually not very rare, but they're very polluting to process. And to me, it's an example of how we in the West, we outsource the pollution. So China got the near monopoly because they were basically willing to take that on themselves and somewhere else. And now, I mean, many places in the Arctic, in Greenland and northern Scandinavia, you have these deposits, but as I mentioned, I mean, if we should process that, it has pollution, social, cultural effects. And in northern Scandinavia, we have a lot of land use conflicts around these questions.
Yes, it's all connected with pollution and economic reasons to extract it, because sometimes it's very expensive to process and to extract and then produce this rare metals in the form that will be useful and then sell it. That's why Russia didn't develop all the potential sites which are available to mine. They just started with the most needed elements, like nickel, copper. But now they also want to have a lead in lithium, for example, because they see the potential and the need of lithium for the green transition in the world. So they are rapidly developing the mining sites, and the interesting fact is that the company which is developing it is Rosatom and Norilsk Nickel. And Rosatom is the most trustworthy company for Russian president, and they're actually controlling everything what is happening in the Arctic. Northern development of this northern sea route, gold mines on the Chukotka, now lithium in the European Arctic part.
If I can just add very quickly, what I said, this thing about that the state of technology should be kept in mind. So when the world economy was very much, how to say, a fossil fuel-driven system, the Soviet Union, Russia, was a major provider of oil and gas. In a decarbonized energy system where minerals are going to be crucial, then Russian minerals become crucial.
That's also why no one is sanctioning Norilsk Nickel, because nickel is a very important metal now, and there are very few countries extracting and selling it on the market.
I think this is fascinating. This brings me to the famous saying, it's all about economy, stupid. We have to look what all these economic interests behind political decisions. Are there more questions? Yes, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Peter Wolf from Just an Interested Student here. Thank you very much for this very interesting event. I have a question concerning the icebreakers that Russia is planning to build. You said 8 new nuclear icebreakers. The West doesn't have nuclear icebreakers at all. What is the intention of Russia developing these ships? And does the West maybe need a nuclear icebreaker or a fleet of icebreakers? Thank you very much.
The intention is to develop the Northern Sea route because they want to have the all year round sailing, and without the icebreakers it's practically not possible to do it. And since they want to intensify the shipping, they want to develop the whole fleet to be able to do this. And also they plan to, they want to increase not only their own shipping, because now it's mostly Russia shipping out the resources from the Arctic. But they also want to increase the transit and then to service this icebreaker service for foreign ships. That's why they need more.
Thank you. Go ahead.
If I can add very quickly to that, I think Ksenia explained very well why it's natural for Russia to need this big icebreaker fleet. If you look at the 7 Arctic countries, the 7 NATO Arctic countries, I mean, the Baltic states, Finland needs icebreakers to keep its ports open in the winter unless climate change has taken care of that. But if you look at the United States, I mean, in my view, the United States does not really need icebreakers. Of course, the Alaska congressional delegation, the US Coast Guard, will endlessly call for icebreakers, but in my view, that's just congressional politics.
Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name is Gertrud Illmeier. I'm a social anthropologist and I did research in Eastern Siberia and in the north of Russia. And I want to draw attention on the aspect of population, of people living in this, in the Arctic region. And it is of course not only indigenous people, but it is many other population who mainly work there as shift workers. And my question to you is, taking into consideration all these development plans, you need workforce for these endeavors. Do you consider, or are there projections on future migratory movements in migration? I mean, we have heard that the permanent population is decreasing, that's well known, but these people are replaced by shift workers. And I'm just wondering whether future movements and developments in population shifts might be considered in your research. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to start?
Well, I can say that Russia is trying to invite people to Arctic, and there are some programs. The salaries in the Arctic regions are already, and historically they were way higher than in other parts of the Russia. Now there is also a program called the Arctic Hectare that anyone can who wants to relocate to the Arctic region can get a free hectare for building a house and living there. It's not yet very popular, and I'm not sure it will become very popular, but they are trying to invite people. Of course, with the shift workers, it's easier. Now with the very difficult situation with the employment rate in Russia, it's very attractive to come for some work in the Arctic and to get a lot of money for that, which they are not able to get in their own regions at all.
Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, in northern Scandinavia, well, in Western Europe and in Europe in general, we have shrinking, aging populations. And that, of course, is just more extreme in northern Scandinavia. The only thing that stops northern Scandinavia from falling population is Ukrainian refugees. I don't see, I mean, how to say, turning around those demographics for Europe in general and for the northern Scandinavia in particular. I think that's very much uphill struggle. I don't see how it's possible to turn around those demographics.
Thank you very much. We are on time. I want to, please, go ahead.
Well, I want to ask a question to Ksenia.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Ksenia, you told us about the persecution and repression of environmental NGOs. I was basically wondering what that persecution is about. So in a political economy as Russia, so my hypothesis, which you can reject or confirm, is that it's not about the environment. It's about political stability. It's about not threatening the people who are in power. And it's basically about the economic interests of those people in power. So how to say, the environmental issue is a kind of proxy for political stability and the economic interests of those people in power. Is that a valid hypothesis?
Yes, of course it is, because most of the pollution is also connected with corruption, and corruption is connected to people in power on the regional level or on the national level. And then even way before the war, what we saw is that if some local protest is against of the local company which pollutes, it's relatively easy and can be dealt with on the court level or on the pre-court level. But if it touches the interests of someone in the regional government or someone in of the big companies, then it was almost impossible to do something. And then, of course, the most vulnerable environmental activists are those who are fighting with the actual pollution, actual companies, not those who are doing environmental education or collecting waste or planting trees. This is, it was long before that the government was directly saying that this kind of environmental activities are fine, this kind of environmental activities are not fine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rasmus. Thank you, Ksenia. And well, I invite you all to have a coffee and a talk with our speakers until for about 15 minutes, and then we shall come to the real scientific stuff about climate change and the cryosphere. Thank you both, and well, have a coffee, relax. It's all very, I know it is all very optimistic, but this is what reality is like right now. Our next presentation, I will not say it's a panel because it's a presentation. We are learning here. There is a bit of a pedagogical aspect to it. It will be about climate and the changes of climate. And we have one of the best speakers on what happens to ice and glaciers. Her name is Guðfinna Aðalgeirsdóttir. But since her youth, everyone uses her nickname Toli. And in fact, there is this small ice, it is like a little ice mountain. Small mountain in the Antarctic that carries her name. She's a professor of glaciology at the Institute of Earth Sciences at the University of Iceland. Her work focuses on the interaction of climate and glaciers, ice sheets, by monitoring and modeling the response of glaciers and ice caps to climate change. She has previously worked on coupling ice sheets and climate models for the Greenland ice sheet and the Danish Meteorological Institute in Copenhagen in order to improve sea level rise projects. You can see she has studied all over, including at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, her PhD, then in Alaska, and of course in Iceland. She is one of the head authors. Toli is one of the head lead authors of the Chapter 9 of the 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I would like you to tell us what is happening in the Arctic when it comes to ice. There is rain, I understand now. There is for the first, that didn't exist before. There are storms that didn't exist before. Could you give us an overall picture? What are these huge changes that are producing climate changes and that we are all affected by? When we talked twice before this event, and I would like you to keep in mind, when scientists talk, they speak 100 years. So it is what will happen by 250, what will happen by 2100. And we are thinking of like in 4 years and 5 years. And as Toli was saying to me, when I tell them this is, when I tell people this will happen by 2100, they say, oh, well, it doesn't affect me. Well, it does, because it's already happening. And we met in Iceland at a conference. Toli was participating in an event. And I remember one thing that really struck me. She said, the situation is burning. We scientists know what is going to happen, but we are not politicians. And in your explanation, you will also tell us what is it that we know for sure that is going to happen, and what do we think is going to happen, and what could be the surprises. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation to come here. This is really exciting for me, and I think it's an opportunity. And we talked a few times, like Marina said, and I think this is maybe a little bit as a pedagogical opportunity for me also, because I realize that even though scientists have the feeling that we are putting this information out there, it's still, like you said, not very accessible. So I have maybe two purposes here now. I want to give you access to what we call the assessment reports of the IPCC. I was one of the lead authors of the 6th assessment report, and also to talk about the consequences of the glacier loss for sea level rise. But before that, I want to talk about what the cryosphere is. And cryosphere is everything that is frozen: glaciers, permafrost, snow, and sea ice. So I'll go through those components of the cryosphere and how they're affected by climate change. So the IPCC reports come out regularly. It started already in 1988 that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created, and since then, 6 assessment reports have been produced. And this is kind of like a myriad of reports, and already in this 6th assessment cycle, those 6 reports were produced. And it starts with Working Group 1, physical science basis. Working Group 2 is working on the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And then Working Group 3 is working on the mitigation of climate change. And it really is all those 3 aspects that are provided, the information, and it really is the state of knowledge about the climate change. And in this 6th assessment cycle, there were also some special reports that were focused on global warming on 1.5 degrees. And this is really laying the foundation for the Paris Agreement decision to move the target of the Paris Agreement says we will limit global warming to 2 degrees, but we will do everything we can to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And it's basically because of what is written in this report here, 1.5 degrees is really the target we should be aiming for. But that means that we have very high urgency because the time is running out, and I'll show you later why I say that it really is very, very important that we limit the warming to 1.5 degrees, and we don't really have much time to do it. So also to give access to the way those reports are written, I give you the kind of guidance that the authors of these reports are given. So it's not the scientists writing the report, they are not doing science themselves, they're assessing the state of knowledge. And they go through these 3 steps. First, evaluate the evidence and agreement. So we go through, are there observations, are there models, are there experiments, are there processes we understand? And if there is enough of those or sufficient evidence, we go and evaluate the confidence. And what we do is really check on those 2 axes. Are there many evidence for certain things? And we can take, for example, is Greenland ice sheet losing mass? Is it getting smaller? If there is a lot of evidence, we come along this axis here. And if they are all agreeing, we come along this axis. And for example, the example I took is Greenland ice sheet losing mass. We are really in this high agreement, lots of evidence, and they're all saying the same. So we put very high confidence on that. And once we have the high confidence, we can then evaluate statistical likelihood. And then this is the really like the likelihood language that we are adopting. And if the certainty is more than 99%, we say that it's virtually certain. And those words are really put into the text in the locations where they are appropriate. And for example, likely, that's a word we had to kind of train ourselves to not use lightly, because it has the statistical meaning. If it's written likely, that means that it has greater than 66% probability of happening. So that's really the key to the statements that are then later on in the report. This is an example, and I thought there's a lot of text, but I think it's very important to read this. This is out of Summary for Policymakers of the Synthesis Report. And this is the quote here, it's B13, this is the sentence. And I think because I'm only going to talk about the cryosphere, the sea ice and the permafrost and the glaciers, I think it's important that we read this through. So continuous emissions will further affect all major climate system components. With every additional increment of global warming, changes in extremes continue to become larger. Continued global warming is projected to further intensify the global water cycle, including its variability, global monsoon, precipitation, and very wet and very dry weather and climate events and seasons. High confidence. So that means that we have lots of evidence and they all agree. In scenarios with increasing CO2 emissions, natural land and ocean carbon sinks are projected to take up a decreasing proportion of these emissions. high confidence again. So this is really important. The more CO2 we emit into the atmosphere, less proportion of it is taken up by the natural sinks. So more of it is going to have an effect on the global climate. And then this is the part I'm going to talk about. Other projected changes include further reduced extent and or volume of almost all cryospheric elements. So cryospheric elements is really my topic today. And almost, virtually certain, further global mean sea level rise. And increase in ocean acidification, virtually certain, that means more than 99% confidence, and deoxygenation. So that's how we read this information. It's a go-to place for assessed state of the knowledge. And a lot of information, and I will only give you a glimpse into that. So the key message here, and I think this is a very strong message here, that the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is highest now than it has been in at least 2 million years. And this number here is actually increasing a little bit. The sea level rise is fastest now rising than it at least the last 3,000 years. The Arctic sea ice area is at the lowest level in at least 1,000 years, and the retreat of glaciers is unprecedented in at least 2,000 years. So those are really fast changes, and they are really having an effect. Unless there is immediate, rapid, and large-scale reduction in greenhouse gas emission, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. And this is really a very important message here. And I take this figure here. This is out of summary for policymakers. This is a 10th figure in that summary. And I think this is an interesting figure, and I want to put it, even though it's not cryospheric, but this is really the big picture here. And this is not a time scale. Along the x-axis here is the cumulative CO2 emissions. The further we go along this axis, the more CO2 is in the atmosphere. And we start in 1850 here. And on the y-axis is the temperature increase. So there is this quasi-linear relationship between the accumulated emissions of CO2 and warming. And that has really grave consequences. And we are here now. This is the historical emissions. We have already emitted the amount that is along the axis here. And those are the different scenarios that I will talk about later. So I want to put this figure here to indicate what it means, those different scenarios. So it really is a carbon budget. How much will we put into the atmosphere until 2050? And those are the different scenarios. The lightest one, the light blue, is if we manage to limit the emission, we stay on this line here. But the more and more we put, the longer along this axis we go. So the consequences are really these here. And we see here, we are already here, this is the current level. We have warmed the atmosphere by 1.1 degree already. And we are already responding and seeing consequences of that. Those are the Paris Agreement levels, 1.5 degree and 2 degrees. And this really means that we have a carbon budget. So this is really the cake we have on the plate. And do we want to eat all the cake, or do we want to leave something for the future generation, is the question we have to ask ourselves. At the current rate, 2090, we are emitting about 35 gigatons of CO2 every year, means that in order to get this level, with the current rate of emission, it will only take us a few decades, only 1 or 2 decades to reach this 1.5 degree limit. If we think a little bit further, and this is really the question, how far along this axis we go, it really is about every emitted CO2 mass. And it's really not very much time we have. And there is a reason why we want to keep 1.5 degree limit, but it's also, and I think we also need to emphasize that this is not all or nothing. Everything that we can do to limit and we get not as far along this axis as possible will have an effect. So let's now think about the cryosphere. So the permafrost, as we have seen, both Rasmus and Ksenia have shown this Arctic view of the world. Those color indicates where the permafrost is. So there is like a sporadic and discontinuous and continuous permafrost. These are the regions that have frozen ground permanently. And of course, in some regions, there is a seasonal thaw in the summertime, and then it freezes again. Now I give you the sentence from the IPCC report. Increases in permafrost temperatures have been observed over the past 3 to 4 decades throughout the permafrost region. High confidence, it means we are along both axes. Many evidence, they're all agreeing. And further global warming will lead to near-surface permafrost volume loss. Those temperature measurements are from different regions in the Arctic. You would maybe recognize some of those locations. They're all showing the same temperature is increasing. And it warmed globally by 0.3 degrees. This is the likely range, and likely now means the 66% probability that it was within this range in this period. So they're looking at very small period here. Everywhere the permafrost is warming. The snow cover, and it was really hard, I didn't know where to look at a picture for the snow cover. So this is from last week. I was in the ski resort in Akureyri, where Rasmus is affiliated. This is one of the use of snow cover that we have in our part of the world, but we also need to think not only about ourselves, but also about the ecology in those regions. So snow will have a big effect on, for example, the reindeers or any animals that are dependent on the snow. And the report is saying this: Northern Hemisphere spring snow cover extent has been decreasing since 1978, very high confidence. And there is high confidence that this trend extends back to 1950. This is the figure showing that the extent is decreasing, and further degrees of Northern Hemisphere seasonal snow cover extent is virtually certain under further global warming. These are figures a little bit hard to understand, but this is the sensitivity of the snow and permafrost. And along both axes is the amount of warming. And you can see it's the same story. The further we go along here, this is not the CO2 anymore, but this is the temperature. The snow cover will reduce its volume, and the global permafrost as well. So those are the projections, and it really is important where along this axis we end up with our emissions. So now the sea ice, I'm thinking I'm running out of time maybe, but the sea ice, this is a figure from Saturday. I pulled this from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder. This shows the state of the sea ice on Saturday. I'm pulling out information from the report. The current Arctic sea ice coverage levels are the lowest since at least 1850 for both annual mean and late summer values, and for the past 1,000 years for the late summer values. So those are the statements here. The figures showing the retreat of both the maximum extent of the sea ice and the minimum extent, and maybe this is unfamiliar that there is a seasonal change in the amount of sea ice, but it really is responding to summer and winter. So it decreased both in summer and winter, and the sea ice is coming younger, thinner, and more dynamic. So the thicker sea ice is melting away also. And this is from the NSIDC. This is called the interactive sea ice graph, and it shows this. Currently, we are here along this blue line. The sea ice is still increasing because the extent of the sea ice is increasing, and then in the summertime it's decreasing, and then those are the seasonal changes. This figure here is showing the mean of the 1980 to 2010 media, and the ranges are here. So I drew the 1982 extent, and that's the yellow line here. But and if I just put the extents for the previous years, you can see that all those lines are getting further and further down. The summer extent is decreasing. And just to show you here, this is along the line that we are coming here at the lower level of the historical extent. So Arctic Ocean will likely become practically sea ice free. So that means less than 1 million square kilometers during the seasonal sea ice minimum. So in the summertime, for the first time before 2050, in all considered SSP scenarios. And practically ice-free state is projected to occur more often with higher greenhouse gas concentration, and it will become the new normal for high emission scenarios by the end of this century. High confidence. So just to educate a little bit more, now we have talked about the sea ice. I have the volume here, the area, and the potential sea level rise. Of course, if the sea ice is melting, the sea level will not rise because the sea ice is already floating in the ocean. But then we have the other glaciers in the world. So the ice in Antarctica, Greenland, and ice sheet. And you can see here the volume of Antarctica and Greenland is much, much bigger than all the other glaciers in the world. And if we take this potential sea level rise, Antarctica is storing so much ice on land that if we just mentally melt it and put it into the ocean, it will raise the sea level 58 meters. If we do the same with Greenland ice sheet, the ocean sea level will rise 7.5 meters, and all the other glaciers in the world, in Patagonia, in Svalbard, in Iceland, in the Himalayas, it's less than 0.5 meter. And those ice masses are losing mass. So the glaciers are losing mass, and the sea level is rising. These are pictures taken with some time interval on a location looking at a glacier in the south coast of Iceland. This is Sólheimajökull, and you can see the dates at the lowest part of the figure. And I'd just like to go back here to show that those changes are really big. So those landscape forms are really disappearing. And this is not the only place, it's happening all over the world. Oops, no, I went the wrong direction. So quite impressive that in front of our eyes, we see those changes. And this is happening everywhere where we have glaciers in the world. So this is the local map showing all those 19 regions that are showed in this figure. It's a complicated figure out of the chapter 9 here. But if I just draw your attention to all the glaciers in the world, the rate of mass loss of the glaciers is increasing in the last 2 decades. Greenland and Antarctica are also losing mass. So we can think of losing mass or raising the sea level. So both those figures are showing the same. This is the contribution of Antarctica and Greenland to sea level rise, and it has manifolded over the last decade. So this is when the satellite started measuring, the 2 ice sheets were contributing 2 millimeters per decade, and now they're contributing 30 millimeters of sea level rise per decade to the sea level rise. And there are many processes working to raise or acting on the sea level changes. And we can just pull another figure out of chapter 9 here. This is the ocean budget. And in this period, so the ocean or the sea level has already risen 20 centimeters since the beginning of since 1900. But in this period, 50% of the ocean rise, or the sea level rise, was thermal expansion. So those different levels of ocean are expanding, so that also is causing the sea level rise. But then the contribution of the glaciers, even though they are only 0.5 meter sea level rise, or less than 0.5 meter, they are contributing actually more than the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. But you can see in this gray and the dark gray columns here that those are really taking up speed, and they are increasing the contribution. So they actually, in the last few years, have taken over. And then there's a change in land water storage. So to end, I want to talk about the sea level rise. So this is also out of the report, and I've already said that the sea level rise rose faster since 1900 than over any other prior century in the last 3,000 years. So this is the sea level estimated from different sources, and these are the measurements that we have. The average rate of sea level rise was 1.3 millimeters in the period 1901 to 71. It was increasing to 1.9 and further increasing to 3.7 millimeters a year in the last decade. High confidence. And they say very likely that the human influence was the main driver of those increases since at least 1971. And I end with the projection. Again, now we go back to those different scenarios. Remember, those scenarios mean how far along the cumulative CO2 emissions we put in the atmosphere. And until 2050, there is limited sensitivity to the rise or to the scenario. So you can see here that until 2050, it doesn't really matter in which scenario we are on, but after that, it starts to make a difference. So we already have seen 20 centimeter sea level rise from the 1901. So you can see that's this historical one. And we will see further about 20 centimeter rise under both low emission and high emission scenarios until 2050. Remember, it's virtually certain that the sea level rise will continue to become higher. And then it's going to be very important. And this is really the time scale that we talked about. I'm telling you what's going to happen in 2100, but we are gradually getting there. And it's very important that we limit on which pathway we are here. So by 2100, we can have, depending on if we are on low or high greenhouse gas emission, about 0.5 meter or up to 1 meter sea level rise globally. And then by 2150, we continue, and it can be more than 1 meter sea level rise. But we also, in this report, went further than this. This is the same figure as I showed you before, but now I needed a different scale here. So this is 2300. The uncertainty is increasing, and it's impossible to rule out a 15-meter sea level rise globally by 2100 because we have this, what we can call a wild card of Antarctica, but we don't really have good models to model what's going to happen. And it is possible, and that's this line here, that it's possible that Antarctic ice sheet may actually lose mass faster than the model that we currently are using can project. So Antarctica is really the wild card. And those are really now, maybe we are zoning out a little bit, this is far into the future, but our decisions now will have a big effect on which pathway we are on. It is possible, and those are all the results from the IPCC report. NASA had made this sea level tool. You can actually go yourself, you can select which contribution, if you can look at only the contribution of Greenland or all the components, which decade and which scenario, and then see the global map or even select a region that you're interested in, because it's not unified over the whole world how fast the sea level is rising. So I recommend the NASA sea level tool projection is really interesting. And then finally, my strong message here, to limit global warming, strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases are necessary. And to be on a little bit positive side, this would not only reduce the consequences of climate change, but also improve the air quality. Thank you.
Before the audience asks questions, I have one. Could you just explain, it's the ice melts or the glaciers melt and the sea level rises. Could you explain what happens when permafrost melts and CO2 and methane?
Yes, yeah, I forgot that. That's something else also. So the permafrost in the whole Arctic region that we mentioned before is actually preventing decomposition of remains. So this is not my expertise, but what happens basically is that when the permafrost is thawing and losing its grips on the ground, more methane is going to be emitted. So there is actually a big methane sink, or actually storage in the permafrost that will be released when the permafrost is thawing. So that's one of the consequences. And in this presentation, I didn't really talk much about the consequences, but permafrost has really grave consequences of the emissions of greenhouse gases. And as well, the snow conditions will change the habitat of very many species in the regions. And you can imagine your ski resort, local ski resort, is going to suffer quite a lot when the snow cover is reduced. So there's a lot of consequences that all those cryospheric changes will have on societal changes.
Just another question. There are fires in the permafrost area. How come we have fires there when it is cold? Sorry, but it's...
It's a good question, but it can ignite. Once like this is a ground that is around freezing, and then when the temperature is rising, it can change the whole system so that the burning, maybe Ksenia can help me. What is happening with the permafrost burning the methane? Yes, please help me here.
In terms of forest fires in Siberia region, most of the forest fires are caused by people. It's just not carefully treated, and just making a fire in the forest, which brings the damage to the whole area, and then lack of governmental forces which can limit these fires. Because of the restructuring of the forest brigades 10, 15 years ago in Russia, they are not capable to fight the forest fires well and timely enough to prevent. But then, yes, forest fires then bring black carbon into the Arctic region, covering white snow with black particles of graphite, which reflects, which not reflects the sun, but consumes the energy, the sun energy, and also contribute to the warming and melting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is another aspect, and this is why Arctic is warming faster than the global mean average, is because of this albedo effect, the reflection of the solar energy. So if we remove either the sea ice or the snow cover and replace basically a white reflecting surface with a darker surface, and that happens also when there is burning particles coming on the snow, then rather than reflecting the solar energy, it's like the ground is absorbing the energy that further increase the warming. So that's one of this is what we call the Arctic amplification, is that we are losing reflecting surfaces, the snow and the sea ice, and that increases the absorption of the solar radiation in those regions.
Why do you think that the politicians are not reacting? I know you're not a politician. We were talking, I learned when I was in Iceland, there is this town called Ísafjörður, which is something like Hallstatt here in Austria. And it's a tiny town, and there are 200 cruise ships per year that pass through there. And Tolly explained to me these ships use crude oil. So we always expect Scandinavian or northern countries to be respectful, and somehow things are not as the perceptions.
Yes. What to do about it is really what is needed to be discussed. And I think, and also maybe Ksenia can reflect on this, that for some reason there has been like a social license for doing a lot of things that we know are not good for us. For our health or for our environment and even for the ecology. And I think one of the things that is really like the big task ahead of us is removing this social license of bringing crude oil in the Arctic or really anywhere and burning the fossil fuels or doing all those pollutions and emissions that are really having this effect that I have presented here from the IPCC report. We know what's going on, and we know what's needed in order to both reduce it and hopefully stop it. The goal is really, and we have agreed to that, the goal is a carbon neutral world by 2050. And we here in the room, we really have to discuss and think about the ways to get to this goal of carbon neutrality. And one of those things are removing social license for doing all those things that we think are maybe okay, but they are not really.
Could you just explain to us, we are not scientists, rising the ocean means what exactly? What consequences other than cities may disappear, infrastructure might disappear? What will be the other consequences as a result of the rise of the oceans?
More frequent flooding over those areas. And really, if you just imagine all the people living on the coast and the rising sea level, for example, in island communities in the Pacific, their habitat is really going to be removed. So we have places that are probably basically not going to exist because the ocean has covered it now. I don't know, Ksenia, did you have a point to make?
I just wanted to comment on the use of heavy fuel oil in shipping, because this is an important issue for the Arctic countries, and the agreement to limit HFO was discussed for years, and now 7 NATO Arctic countries agreed that they will limit the use of oil in ships. but not that soon as the environmentalists wanted. But still, there is an agreement. Russia didn't sign this agreement, and they continue to use this heavy fuel in their Arctic shipping. Trying to, at least they had plans to transfer shipping to LNG, which is a little bit cleaner fuel, but still it emits greenhouse gases, but not black carbon. Even with transferring shipping to LNG, there is technological problems with that, so I don't expect it in the near future with the Russian shipping.
Thank you. Georg and then Rasmus. Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
no, sorry. So it's really like a big tank ship that we really need to change the course of.
Yes, and Norway is trying to, at least some businesses and environmental organizations like Belong and trying to push the Arctic shipping towards clean fuels like electricity, for example.
Thank you. Georg, Rasmus, yeah, first.
Thank you very much. Krauchenberg Institute for the Danube region. I have a question. Are you also, is your institute, your university, into studies concerning the Gulf Stream, the effects on the Gulf Stream? Because more recently there were reports in the media. I wonder if you're also dealing with that. Thank you.
So I'm not an oceanographer, but I follow this very closely because the glaciers in Iceland are really responding to changes in the ocean currents. And that's one of the things that we can actually go and look up in the report. In chapter 9, actually, it was about the ocean. And then we can go back to the speak of the IPCC scientist that it's high confidence that the Gulf Stream will reduce its power, or the flux of water towards the north will reduce, but how much is not, and how fast is not very high confidence in. So that means we don't have enough evidence, or they are not all agreeing to put a high confidence in it. There is a high confidence that the ocean current will be affected, and it has really grave consequences. We know that the Gulf Stream is this part of this, what we call the Atlantic overturning meridional circulation, IMOC, and it really is transporting a lot of warmth from the Caribbean up to the north. And that really is controlling the climate in Iceland, in Norway, in other places. And if that ocean current is going to slow down, that not only is going to have an effect of cooling down this region, but it's not transporting the warmth from the Caribbean. So that region is then going to warm even faster than if the current would be in its current strength. So we really need to think about the whole system. So not only, and I think that's something that Mirjana alluded to in the very beginning, that it's all parts. I mean, we are looking at different parts, but it really is a part of whole. So leaving the heat in the Caribbean means that that region is going to warm much faster because the heat is not going out, but it means that the North Atlantic is going to be cooler than it is at present. But that's, I think that's like a disturbance in the big picture of the global warming. So, of course, we really are worried about the ocean current. It's part of the whole climate system. And that's something that there is a high confidence that the current is going to be affected, but by how much and how fast is really still not quite good high confidence in.
Rasmus?
Yeah, thank you, Guðfinna. This was extremely informative. It's just a comment from a political science point of view for this, why is nothing happening? And I often observe colleagues from the natural sciences that they have an explicit or implicit model of decision-making that if people have the right information, they make the right choice. For a social scientist, that is not a very credible hypothesis. People lie and steal and cheat and act in bad faith all the time, all over the place. I would regard climate change as a game theoretical problem. So you may have noticed that from 2009 to 11, I worked for United Nations University in Japan, and I was United Nations University Observer at COP15 in Copenhagen in December 2009, I sat in the UNU observer seat the last night when everything went to hell for the Danish government. It was quite a spectacle. And my experience from the UN system, etc., is that, and I think we see it everywhere, that the individual and national advantages from producing fossil fuels or using fossil fuels. I mean, you look at Norway, look at how much Norway has benefited from its oil and gas. You listen to how key oil and gas is to Russian economy and society. And fossil fuels are so incredibly convenient. And as long as they remain so incredibly convenient, people are going to use them. Because if you don't use them yourself or produce them, you put yourself at a huge disadvantage. And if the others cheat, well, you have the disadvantage now and the world still goes to hell. So you might as well just cheat, and that's what everybody does. So the only solution is changing the game in a game theoretical sense. It is a question of making renewable energy resources more advantageous than fossil fuels. And personally, I must say, I simply don't believe that we can shame anybody into abstaining from the great comparative advantages of fossil fuels compared to renewable energy. We have to change the game in the game theoretical sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the comment.
Thank you, yes.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
So to follow up on those last couple comments, how you scientists must be really depressed because you have all the data and you see nobody doing anything about it. Do any of your colleagues have any solutions about how to make the change? When I was vice president of ABC Television, and the media world has changed globally, but there were a few people who could bring about behavior change. But now we're overwhelmed by lobbyists and big companies and things like that. Do you have any thoughts about how to make this behavioral change? And are any of your colleagues hopeful about this situation, or do you believe that maybe there'll be some technological solution that can come along that allow us to go down this terrible path that we're going down now? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. These are really the questions we are asking ourselves. How do we change behavior? And I think it's a little bit about the social behavior, or social licenses, really. And Rasmus was pointing out that those decisions that we need to take in order to reduce the emissions from burning fossil fuels, the coal, oil, or gas, are really painful, and they're going to be expensive. But it really needs some kind of game change. And I'm actually optimistic because I have seen, and you probably remember better than I, more examples of changes that have happened. And if you just think back to our grandparents, that their expectancy of, I don't know what value to say, happiness or success, are not the same as our requests now. So we have moved, and we are always changing. And I'm optimistic because we have made those changes. We are not smoking in the left-hand side of the airplane anymore. And I think, now thinking about it, that it was actually allowed, and there was a social license for it, is crazy now. And I think in decades from now, we'll think, and they really thought that this was impossible. So we can actually make those decisions, and we have done that before. And it is about changing the game rules, really, and making it disadvantaged because we know the reasons why of burning the fossil fuels. And we don't have much time. We really, and that's my point of the presentation, we are running out of time. There is not much left of the cake. And the question is, do we want to eat the cake, the carbon budget that we have, or do we need to adapt to the consequences? And I think it really is also, and I think I said that already, it's not about all or nothing. We can change a little bit, and we can do gradual changes, and it's really important because every reduction will have an effect. And I think it's about changing the rules. So I'm optimistic because we have done it before.
Thank you. So nice to hear something optimistic. Any more questions?
Thank you very much. I'm not familiar with game theory, but maybe you can outline a bit how this could work to change the game. And a question to you. Thanks for the informative presentation. I guess currently Russia is not delivering any data. And what does this mean for research and for projection of these changes in cryosphere?
So it will, yes, thank you for the question. So the knowledge is really what we are needing. And I think until maybe 2 decades ago, we were gathering knowledge. But at the current state, there is high confidence in all the important things. So not getting data from Russia or other regions will not then improve their further knowledge, but I think at the current state, we have enough knowledge. We don't need more information. And like I was talking with Mirjana, I feel like I'm a broken record. We've said this so many times. There are 6 reports already. The first one came in 1990. The oil companies have had very invested interest in blurring the information and seeding doubt in that this is actually happening. But I think we are beyond that now. We know this is happening. We know what is needed in order to limit the consequences. And it really is about the decisions. And me as a natural scientist, it's really not a question for me, but it's a question for the whole society. And the governments are really playing a very important role. And Rasmus was pointing out that there is this conference of the parties. Those are the parties to the IPCC. Those are the parties to the Paris Agreement. They are meeting and they're holding all the governments accountable for those decisions. And they have already made plans how to become carbon neutral. And the plans are, we're not on the perfect path, but I think it's also something that we have to keep in mind that it's not all or nothing. We can do, like, everything matters, and the faster we do it, the better, but that's really our goal. And I think that kind of painting out the future, and I think 300 years ago, maybe people were not so much thinking about if they want to develop this or that direction, but now, currently, we have the options. We know what's going to happen if we follow the current path, and we can imagine what happens if we change the game and make burning fossil fuel not practical or too expensive. Or I don't know if it's pain or money or what actually motivates people to make changes, but we can paint the carbon neutral future and then actually think about that that's actually more preferable than the path that we are on now. So I think that's another thing that is different now than maybe 300 years ago. And I think 300 years into the future, people will look back and say, yes, actually, they realized what was going on. So I think it's also about time perspective, that we have been thinking very short times, but thinking about maybe 300 time span now, we can think back 300 years back and imagine, or like think back how the people were there, you know, imagining their future, and then we can think 300 years back into the future, and imagine that we look back to our generation and judge the decisions that we are making now. And I think we already know what those judgments will actually include.
Thank you. We have a question online.
Yes, from Christina Thomas, an ally. Addressing climate change requires global cooperation. The Arctic is an example how the recent geopolitical climate has frozen cooperation. What does it mean for the future of climate politics?
Very good question. Maybe this is more for Rasmus than myself. What does it mean?
Well, that was an easy way to get out of that.
Yes. I'm the glaciologist in the room.
So, how to say, very quickly, I mean, I think one way of thinking about that is that we can look at like global complex systems. So what Guðfinna has been describing very well is, of course, global complex environmental systems. What I try to deal with is global complex political, economic, security systems. And something I'm very afraid of is that because of the global changes I talked about, the switch, the transition of economic, scientific, political, etc., power from the West to the rest, managing the global political economic system is getting harder and harder and more dangerous, and it takes all the attention. And there's like an endless urgency. I mean, it's always like winning this war, avoiding that war. And that means a lot of decision-making systems don't get to Guðfinna's global complex environmental systems. And Mirjana has pointed out different timescales that, I mean, so we talk about Arctic cooperation, and there the logic is, well, we have to win the war in Ukraine before we can resume Arctic cooperation with Russia. So there's always, and we have to, I think the United States view would be that we have to convince the Chinese Communist Party to respect the US-led world order before we can do this and that. So we always have to do something before we can get to what Guðfinna is talking about. And that's a big concern to me, because as Guðfinna points out very well, time is running and time is running out. And ideally, we could manage different global complex environmental and human systems at the same time, but that's really demanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I add to this question that was asked online? I learned during the Arctic Circle conference that it's very hypocritical, like many things that are done in the West. There is cooperation with Russian scientists in the sense you can sign articles together, but you cannot use the funds because you cannot sign the articles. In certain countries, you can sign the articles. So people are actually encouraged to use private contacts that they had developed before to keep getting the information. This is what I heard, and then young scientists were saying, but we don't have those contacts. What are we going to do? Go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just add very quickly. I mean, for example, in the Norwegian case, we're allowed to maintain personal contacts with Russian colleagues, but we're not allowed any institutional collaboration. We're not allowed any economic collaboration. And that, of course, basically makes serious work impossible. The only exception in the Norwegian case, or the main exception, is fisheries research, because it's necessary for managing the Barents Sea fisheries. But I also think, I mean, we should be clear in the West that it's not, I used to have a lot of collaboration in Russia, which is all gone. It's not Russia that doesn't want to collaborate with us. I mean, this cut to the collaboration with Russia is a Western decision in response to the Ukraine war. And the longer time it takes, of course, the greater the damage to time series, and the longer time it will take to reestablish whatever the future international political situation is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our time is also out. Is there any, Ksenia, but fast?
A comment to the Arctic cooperation and under the Arctic Council. As Rasmus said, that it's not Russia who doesn't want to cooperate with the Western countries. The thing is that the sense of cooperation from Russia was not to have a positive impact on environment. It was willing to be recognized by major countries as a major player in the Arctic. So the drive for this cooperation wasn't purely humanistic or environmental. It was more political and recognition need for the president.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Tori. And we have learned it's all about politics now. The climate is changing, it's warming up, but politicians have to decide how we survive. Thank you very much. I give you a 10-minute break, and then we shall hear about geopolitics. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the final session of this fascinating workshop that we have and presentations. I think the scene is really well set for this final moment, where we are very honored to have Christopher Rossi, who teaches international law and international relations at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. He has worked on psychology of deterrence. I'd love to hear more about that. Project at the Arms Control Association at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and also with the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and as assistant professor of international relations at the American Foreign Policy at American University, and not least, has served as director on the National Security Council of the Clinton White House in the Office of Democracy and Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. I will add as a footnote in the trivia section that those of us like myself who don't know our geography too well, of course we've heard of Tromsø, but it's on that light blue line where it hits the Norwegian coast. And as I heard at dinner last night with Christopher and his colleagues, there is nearly 2 months of total darkness in winter. So I appreciate the fact that there is a university. And I'd like Christopher to maybe answer a question later on. Is Tromsø threatened by being flooded by the oceans once the ices melt? And where is there thinking at the leadership of the university, where will it move in 60 years' time once the oceans recede? But more seriously, although that is not an unserious question that I posed, I'd like Christopher to give us about a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A. Christopher, please. Thank you.
An open waterway across the top of the world presents exceptional commercial rewards beyond the obvious prospects of resource exploitation or deep water port developments in places such as Alaska, Greenland, Iceland, and Canada. The Arctic also presents the fastest, most direct surface route between Asia and Europe, the world's 2 largest regional trading blocs. So this route, were it reliably navigable, I'd like to return to that as well, because there's a lot of talk about the Northern Sea Route being the next highway to heaven. I don't think it's all that reliably navigable. But if it were, it would save more than a week's transit time per voyage, thereby significantly reducing energy, environment, and transportation costs as compared to more expansive southern routes through the Indian Ocean, Suez Canal, and the Mediterranean Sea. Although rife with security and safety problems of its own, an Arctic route would avoid the politically roiled waters of the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca, and the pirate-infested waters of the Horn of Africa, which we read about every day. Not as easily avoided are the growing concerns of the 4 million inhabitants above the polar circle, 500,000 of whom are indigenous peoples. Their lives will be seriously, dramatically, and permanently affected by the changes in the geopolitical world. The prospect of an opening Arctic ocean space surfeit with untapped living and mineral resources has stimulated reevaluations of Arctic strategies. Updated white papers abound from circumpolar powers and North Atlantic states. Revisions have come forth from the United Kingdom, from the United States, from Denmark, from Germany and France. The European Union, Japan, China, Russia, and India, Norway as well, have recently revamped their Arctic strategies. Norway particularly coming out with a new paper very soon on Svalbard, or what we've heard about before as Spitsbergen. Not the least reason of which has been the war against Ukraine. The war against Ukraine is motivating reevaluations of Arctic strategies. Now, did you know that the northernmost tip of the Shetland Islands is 400 kilometers from the Arctic Circle? Therefore, Great Britain has said it is the Arctic's closest neighbor. And therefore, the Arctic is of critical importance to the UK's security. Not to be outdone, although 1,448 kilometers from the Arctic region, China now proclaims itself to be a near Arctic state. Now, this phrase has been nominalized as meaningless to some Western policymakers, and yet it has been weaponized by others as ominous. Conversation about what that really means might reframe our understanding. The European Union calls itself an Arctic entity and a geopolitical power with strategic day-to-day interests in the European Arctic and the broader European region. Everybody wants a piece of the Arctic pie. Russia has upgraded the Arctic to a region of top priority, no longer registering it as a part of its Western policy, but as part of an organic extension of its domestic Arctic development policy. Accordingly, all mention of multilateral formats for international cooperation have been removed from the Russian profile. India directly links its food security and rural sector development to Arctic climate change and its effects on what India refers to as the third pole, which is the Himalayas. If you go up to Svalbard, you will see that the Indians have a station up there. The Chinese have a station up there. Europeans have stations up there as well. The United States does not, because the United States has a place called Alaska, and we have stations up there. Singapore, China, Japan now have Arctic ambassadors. The United States announced its first ambassador at large for the Arctic region in 2023. It reactivated the Arctic Executive Steering Committee to coordinate federal activities in the Arctic through the Department of Defense. It established the Ted Stevens Center. Have you seen those fellows? They're all over the place to support the military's mission in the Arctic. It also established a diplomatic presence post in Tromsø, Norway, situated at the 69-degree parallel, after reopening its Cold War consulate in Nuuk, Greenland, population 17,000. The geostrategic importance of access to Arctic resources and transit routes is already clear. Russia's Rosatom formed a partnership with the United Arab Emirates to develop a new class of maritime container transport ships along the Northern Sea route. South Korea plies the Arctic waters with its own icebreaker. 3 of its chaebol mega conglomerates, Daewoo, Hyundai, and Samsung, operate marine engineering shipyards to manufacture ice-breaking liquefied natural gas carriers to the Yamal Peninsula, taking Russian Arctic gas to global markets. As the world's largest importer of liquefied natural gas, Japan considers the Russian Arctic a key component to securing its future energy needs. Europe has consciously attempted to decouple energy imports from Russia since the aggression against Ukraine. This severance began less as a consequence of EU action than of decisions taken by the Kremlin. Russia's energy blackmail has spurred an EU effort to phase out dependency on Russian energy imports as soon as possible. However, this rhetoric has exposed one irony and several problematic tensions. Europe's ill-fated dependency on Russian energy has bolstered the ruble and diluted the effects of Western sanctions aimed at pressuring Russia to end the invasion. It has promoted the perception of a strengthened lock and key relationship with China. Notice how I said perception. Russia stands as the gatekeeper of the Arctic for China's penetration via the Bering Sea into the Northern Sea route, and access to Siberian minerals and gas, and China's import demand provides crucial revenue for the greatly distressed ruble. Chinese and Russian geo-economic strategies around energy and transportation are aligning in the Arctic, and at the expense of Western capital influx, energy demands, and bottom-line interests of Western corporations. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin coyly suggested that their countries' aligning friendship has no limits and no forbidden areas of cooperation. Do you believe that? It does suggest, however, a deepening military cooperation against the West as well. It suggests that. While the two countries commonly seek to disrupt the US-led Western world, there is little evidence to suggest that diverging long and medium-term interests in the Far East, the post-Soviet space of Central Asia, and the rapidly evolving region of the northern cryosphere will abate in terms of projected policies vis-a-vis NATO, the West, and the US. Russia and China have major problems dealing with each other. The Arctic Ocean also represents the shortest distance between Asia and Europe for purposes of data accumulation. I don't think we've heard too much about that, but dissemination and fiber optic undersea cable development is going to be a major area of focus for the Arctic. None of the 380 underwater cables in operation around the world has been laid in the Arctic Ocean, although plans for the first pan-Arctic connectivity route are rapidly progressing. Because, of course, if it's the shortest shipping route from China to Rotterdam, it's also the shortest cable route from China to Europe. So the prospect of a single trip signal delay between Japan and Western Europe is 142 milliseconds, which means that that's really immediate information flow. This burgeoning subsea infrastructure creates critical transatlantic cyber attack and hacking security issues for governments heavily dependent on such communications. Despite the potentially devastating effects of climate change, which we have heard about, and Asian Pacific islands, for instance, which we heard about, the APEC countries of Asia are becoming increasingly interested in the Arctic. Arctic energy security benefits appear substantial for Asia. These potential rewards animate increasing engagement among Asian countries in Arctic institutions and dialogues. The economic throw weight of APAC countries active in the Arctic leverages more than the foothold implied by their observer status in the Arctic Council. In other words, I'm basically saying that Asia is going to have an increasing stake in what is fast becoming a globalizing Arctic, whether we like it or not. One of the geopolitical conundrums that my colleagues sometimes don't look past is this idea from the map that the Arctic itself is a gigantic lake surrounded by coastal powers. But the project, when you see that the Indians, when you see that the European Union, that the British with their Shetland Islands, and now the Asians are talking about moving into the Arctic, you wonder the extent to which it is becoming nothing more than a simple little island controlled by the coastal powers. And there's a phenomenon that is associated with the geopolitical structure of the Arctic, which seemingly suggests that Arctic Council states know better about how to maintain the stewardship of the Arctic than anybody else. And they will say that publicly, and they've said it privately. But already an Asian Arctic 5 network has arisen through an amalgam of multi- and minilateral initiatives, including the Arctic Science Ministerial, the International Arctic Science Committee, the mostly entrepreneurial and private Arctic Economic Council, the Asian Forum for Polar Sciences, the Trilateral High-Level Dialogue on the Arctic, and China's, Japan's, and South Korea's accession to the Central Arctic Ocean Treaty. The Central Arctic Ocean Treaty represents the last unexploited fishery in the world. It bobs like an enticing lure atop the world. Although commercial fishing has yet to take place in this inaccessible high seas area, this treaty represents a sea of anticipation by a still out of reach ability to secure its resources, and by a temporary agreement of historic forbearance. The signatories to this treaty have agreed not to fish there for 16 years. Now, it sounds, forget the pieties of global forbearance. Nobody can fish there anyway because it's still ice covered. But the principle is interesting, that we might be seeing a precautionary principle with regard to resource management develop in the Arctic. And that's a very interesting idea to me. It suggests forbearance. It suggests sharing. It suggests a global mentality, which is really what we need to reorient geopolitical constructions of in order to figure out what the solutions will be. By the way, there's a predominant knowledge gap as to how many fish are up in the Central Arctic Ocean. Scientists are investigating whether it might be, relatively speaking, fishless. Nevertheless, this knowledge-based assessment is precisely the kind of open science data collection now held in abeyance by the Western Arctic 7 allies of the Arctic Council. Concerns have already arisen that the treaty itself will not likely prove either sufficiently strong or sufficiently well coordinated to manage increasing human activity in the coming years. Consequently, Asian participation in the fisheries management regime in the Central Arctic waters and elsewhere is too crucial to exclude, and yet, perhaps, too elusive to secure. By either measure, the world's distant water fishing fleets present an inclusive challenge to Arctic governance and to the circumpolar powers' desire to keep their hands on the helm of Arctic decision-making. Now, why would you think that? China, Japan, and South Korea together engage in 58% of the global distance water fishing trade, those three countries. 4 of the 7 largest subsidized long-distance water fleets originate in Asia, with substantial long-distance fishing fleets emerging in India, Vietnam, Chile, and Taiwan. Distant water fleets by far shrink in size when compared to China's fleet. China has expanded their fleet due to depletions of domestic fish stocks all throughout Asia. They're doing the same thing off the coast of Africa. In terms of forbearance, do you think that the Central Arctic Ocean Treaty is going to preclude movements from Asian countries or distant water fishing fleets in the future? Since 1950, heavily subsidized fishing fleets around the world have increased the total fished areas from 60% to 90%. Such diminishing marginal returns threaten commercially viable stocks all across the pristine waters of the polar north and the polar south. China has been accused of tacitly engaging in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, raising national security concerns. And you might think, in the 17th century, when Hugo Grotius looked out into the world, he saw a resource so expansive that he thought nobody could control it. Now, we are engaged in a world of diminishing marginal returns where the fish that we have today in the ocean are going to be less than the fish we have tomorrow. You might think the extent to which geopolitical considerations might revolve around fish. Lots of times it revolves around security. But the fishing stock in the oil and the waters seem to me to have a security implication. Rising Asian Pacific interests in the high north, rapidly receding ice, which we have heard about from a leading world expert just a few minutes ago, emerging resources, submerging shorelines, disappearing ocean features, the need for cyber-resilient underwater digital communications and energy pipelines, distant water fishing fleets, the shrinking global commons contribute to a new reality of global Arctic in this age. The new reality challenges the established binary separation of human history and natural history. It reframes the human being as a geological force, not simply a biological agent. It widens or at least fogs the lens through which the high north is viewed, meshing geological, human, environmental, and political considerations. Geopolitical theorists and international lawyers for hundreds of years have projected a very simple proposition. The land dominates the sea. Coastal states have more to say about oceans than Austria. The land dominates the sea. But the once presumed exclusive ambit of circumpolar powers is now transposing into the inclusive claims of other states. This is the geopolitical reality. This new reality undercuts the jurisdictional assertion that there are only Arctic states and non-Arctic states. It undercuts the 5 circumpolar countries' contention that their propinquity to the pole, their nearness to the pole, grants them unique stewardship rights that make any other concerns nobody's business. It calls into question the theme of Arctic exceptionalism, which my colleague Rasmus was very skeptical of. I'm kind of skeptical of it too. I wonder if it was ever so. There are some security concerns that most of my colleagues will talk about. But the war in Ukraine has sucked Russian troops off of the Arctic Peninsula into Ukraine at such an extent that maybe 20% of formerly staffed positions up in the Arctic now have Russian soldiers attending to them. If you ever talked to, before Sweden ever thought about coming into NATO, did you ever ask a Swedish person in the military which way they point their weapons when they're practicing for defensive services to their country? It's not toward Norway. The strategic circumstances in the Arctic have never changed, not through Ukraine. The strategic interests that the Russians have with their submarine forces off of the Kola Peninsula remain. The reason for that is quite simple. Number one, it's a second strike capability. Number two, if there ever is an engagement in Europe involving Europeans and Russians, the Europeans will have to get fortified by the North Americans through this maritime passageway. So this is why this area also remains important. Lots of geopolitical concerns here. My most favorite one, and I'll leave you with this, is that we talk about guns, and we talk about troops, and we talk about militarization, and we talk about statistics and numbers. But the biggest geopolitical consequence that is on the forefront of humanity's concern is permafrost. It is the biological, it is, we've heard before as well about the methane release, but also the potential pathological entombment of biological agents that can come bubbling up. The biggest geopolitical circumstance that has affected the world in the last 10 years has not been China, it has not been Taiwan, it has not been Donald Trump. It has been COVID. And if it's not COVID, it's going to be bird flu or swine flu or some some issue that we need to reorient our geopolitical consciousness of, particularly when we think of the melting Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, for that comprehensive overview of the geopolitical implications and geostrategic implications of everything that we heard from our first two panels. Before I open the floor, let me just ask you, and I think you put it very forcefully, that basically the whole world is now interested in the Arctic, and that the Arctic Council becomes the kind of nice neighborhood reunion of people who are in fact now being challenged by everybody beyond that neighborhood. How much do you think today the Arctic Council has influence on what goes on given these broader considerations? And then as an additional question, the role of China as the biggest actor, as you rightly pointed out, in a number of these spheres.
I think that the Arctic Council does wonderful stuff in their working groups. We need to get the working groups that are focusing on functional issues in the Arctic. We need to get those back up and running. The Arctic Council itself has something of an identity crisis, an identity problem. It's supposed to be non-political. It's supposed to be kind of a coffee clutch of right-minded people thinking about how to solve common problems. It was supposed to work according to consensus. But now, how do you have an organization that can work according to consensus if the largest stakeholder in the organization is no longer there? And what does that mean about the process of consensus to begin with? So I think the Arctic Council has to get over that hump. It doesn't help that Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks leaker, dumped a whole bunch of information a couple of years ago, which is in the public domain, which tells you what the Arctic Council 5, the circumpolar powers, actually think about Iceland and Finland and Sweden. It's that old adage about the land dominating the sea. It's really about the club that is within the club. Now, with regard to China, the Chinese, I think, are big problems in the South China Sea. I think Taiwan is a big problem. I think the Indian Ocean is a big problem. And I think anything that the Chinese can do to distract the West or to distract people away from those hot button issues by having them fortify places that aren't really that geopolitically tough is to their advantage. And I think the Russians also see this, but the Russians are caught betwixt and between. The Russians see the Chinese as eroding their influence in Central Asia. The Russians see the Chinese as creating Russian dependencies on their exports at reduced prices, and the Chinese are certainly able and willing to purchase Russian resources at bargain basement prices. But the costs with regard to Russia's identity in the Far East and in Central Asia are becoming problematized. And that's why I think that people who weaponize the idea that China has said, we want to be a near Arctic neighbor. We are a near Arctic neighbor. Yeah, okay. If you will say that, that's fine. I mean, the European, the British, everybody's a pal of the Arctic now. What you can actually do with regard to managing this space is quite different. One more thing. The Russians have, for 400 years, been developing the Northern Sea Route. Their Pomar people came over came over the sea routes, and then they penetrated Siberia through the riverine valleys, which is what the Europeans did to Africa anyway. Everybody who wants to conquer a nation will find a river, then go up it. In doing that, they developed a very important system. There are 16 ports all along the northern sea route. The United States for decades has been trying to get one deep water port in Nome, Alaska. The Russians have billions of dollars, hundreds of years, and a deep emotional attachment to this area. They conquered it. They conquered this area faster. By the time they conquered this area, the Muscovites came over the Ural Mountains. In 100 years, they were all the way over to China, before the American frontiersmen had even jumped over the Appalachians. So this was a tremendous kind of emotional, ideological, nationalistic project that creates great anxiety when the Russians look to see how it's all crumbling now before them. And the Ukraine war has definitely made that problematic. Now with Finland, now with Sweden involved, and these are substantial northern high altitude fighting forces. These people know how to fight in bad weather. And the US Marines have been coming over there, Norway, to ask them, how do you do this? But this kind of domination is seen from Russia as yet another problem. Their whole fear of encirclement is now multiplied by the Baltic. The Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake. It is a NATO lake. It is totally controlled by and surrounded by NATO countries. This, I think, has a very important psychological effect on Russian thinking in the Arctic. They're losing the Baltic. They've lost Finland. They got worries about the Chinese moving in, and now they see that they're isolated from the Arctic Council in a way that is causing their northern sea vision to shrink.
Thank you. Let me open it up. I see a question there, and please identify yourself.
Thank you very much, sir. Peter Wolf from Institute Student. If I one day reach your level of eloquency, then I am going to be a happy man, because then I would have held a lot of speeches and read a lot. I have two questions regarding Russia. You said there is a northern battle group being built up in Russia. What purpose does this have? Is it going to be effective against a potential scenario in Norway and Finland? And with the Arctic ice melting away, is this going to open up new opportunities for Russia's northern fleet, Murmansk, Norilsk, and so on and so forth? Thank you very much.
I didn't understand the first part of your question.
The first part was that if I one day reach your level of eloquence when giving speeches,
I heard
I'm
that
going
part,
to
yeah.
be, or the first question you mean, or
Yeah, the first question.
the northern battle group, the specialized forces
Yes.
for the Arctic region.
Yeah.
They're all-weather units.
Yeah.
And what is the purpose of them? Are they going to be used in a potential scenario about Finland or Norway?
Yeah, that's a good question. And by the way, we're all students here, so I'm still on the trail that you're just starting. So that's fine. And it's admirable that you can that you're taking your time to be here and try to figure these questions out, as are we all. The Russians have their best trained forces up on the border of Kirkenes. They do, and the Norwegians have a listening post right across the border, and they're bird dogging this special force. But I basically see that as a distraction. I don't think, nobody's coming across the border, especially from the east, especially when the Russians have moved 80% of their forces southward. It's never been the case that, well, maybe for if anybody's from Finland, excuse me, I don't want to offend you, but yeah, fundamentally, aside from the Finns, it's never been really a concern in the last 50 years. The second question, again, I'm sorry, can you just repeat that?
about the Northern Fleet stationed in Murmansk and Norilsk, if the melting ice caps is going to open new opportunities?
Mostly, there's 28 submarines that the Russians have up there. Some of them are ballistic, some of them are attack, some of them are cruise missiles. Those are the things that you pretty much have to worry about. The melting ice presents huge economic, psychological problems for the billions and billions of dollars of cabotage systems the Russians have been developing over 400 years to make the Northern Sea Route expandable toward both the Pacific and the Atlantic. If the ice melts to such an extent that you can develop, and Rasmus showed you this in his picture, there's a transpolar route that can come about. So no longer do you need to have these cargo ships hire Russian pilots to go through these very narrow straits in the Laptev Sea, in the Kara Sea, which are shallow. They found a new highway. And the highway is leading to places like Iceland and Denmark and Svalbard. You can go across the top of the world, or pretty much toward the western tip of Greenland. And that won't complicate what the Russians have done with regard to the extraction purposes for which the Northern Sea Route were originally developed. But in terms of making this the next Suez Canal, which Putin foolishly tried to convince people of, it's not going to happen. I once had a nice chat with the commandant for the U.S. Coast Guard. And we were talking about the Northern Sea Route. And you can talk about it, from a strategic point of view, but you better talk to a mariner, because someone who knows the problems of sailing will tell you all the problems that are associated with moving big ships through that dangerous area. It is still an extremely dangerous place even today. When in June, I went to Svalbard, and we were trolling with scientists. Actually, anybody up there should only be a scientist. But these scientists are looking out the windows of the SS Helmer Hansen, which is a research vessel owned by the Norwegians. And here comes a sailing vessel. It's a pleasure craft up at the 80th parallel. Now, if anything happens, if you spring a leak, if you have appendicitis, you're going to have a very difficult time getting help. This is still a very, very barren area. In fact, in the United States, if you see, the United States, as I said, it only had one way to fortify the Arctic, and that was through the Aleutian Islands. You have to go to refit the Arctic, you have to go through Dutch Harbor. It takes days just to get into the Arctic oceans. The United States is trying to develop a port here, a deep water port. But the fortifications come from Dutch Islands, so they have to go all the way here, then all the way there. It takes days, even weeks. So,
just to remind us, it was Ksenia who alerted us to the fact of the huge waves. I mean, there may be no ice, but there are so many other challenges if you're sailing, as you just said.
But by the way, when you started this conversation, you were wondering what the fate of Norway would be to climate change, and it is a serious question in Norway. But the Norwegians are not concerned, because the scientists say that their rocky, craggy shores are going to make it someone else's problem.
Okay.
So if you need real estate suggestions, buy Norwegian coastal property.
Okay, we can take one more question.
as you mentioned, the problem may not be as much with Norway, but maybe even with the Russian coast in the north, because there we have the permafrost. When it's melting, then all these river systems, they may also have problems. What is your take on that? Thank you.
So when the permafrost, you know, the Russians have a tremendous infrastructure across Siberia. And it's all based on having foundations sunk into the permafrost that are supposed to be stable. But with a melting permafrost, roads are buckling. With a melting permafrost, roads are buckling, houses are becoming unstable. You're getting increasing avalanches. I know that in Svalbard, in Longyearbyen, which is, it was tucked into a valley that was thought to be very, very stable. But with climate change, it's raining more in Svalbard. And the rain destabilizes the slopes, and it causes these
landslides.
Yes, and it causes landslides, and people have died. In fact, if you go to Longyearbyen, you'll see what the Norwegian response is to keep this outpost up there and functioning. They spent, I don't know how much money to catch the mountain from sliding down. So the permafrost, I think, is going to have incredible economic consequences for these vast stretches between these clumpy towns that the Soviets built in their perfectly idiotic central planning systems. So they have very long period. I think there's 7 or 8 time zones, there's 11 across Russia, but I think 7 or 8 are across Siberia, across where 60% of this land is frozen, but not for long. So whatever they have been developing for a very, very long time is going to be rendered problematic. And to fix it or to maintain it is going to probably require a solution like in Alaska, where in Alaska, they just didn't build roads. So these native indigenous populations rely on airplanes to bring provisions in and out. And that's also probably a very inefficient way to sustain human habitation.
Chris, thank you very much for really drawing out here a very broad and deep picture of the challenges and of the actors and, of course, of the issues that we are confronting. To go back to what Rasmus was saying and our other speakers, I mean, the short-termism in which we live in, the presentism, as Rasmus said, but in fact, we are being worked by these deeper waves and as the French historians would say, the longue durée, which is unfolding for thousands of years, as Tali said, but also in what we call the modern times of the past 200 years. So please join me in thanking Chris and all the other speakers. Thank you. And to Mirjana for the closure of this event.
Well, it's not. Well, I thank you so much for your attention. I thank you for being here. I thank every single speaker there. You have all been so brilliant. You have said so many things that we have to think about. And more than one participant said, I've never thought of this aspect. I've really learned something. And we are also getting incredible feedback online saying the same thing. And so to say to Toli, what is the next step? It is about communication. And communication is very important, but we also know from the media perspective, it is not easy to reach all the audiences. I want to thank everybody and use the opportunity to announce our next event, which is on Zoom, and it is online, it is on Zoom. It's on the 4th of March from 9:30 to 10:30 Vienna time. We shall have a conversation with one of the world experts on Russian propaganda, who will be speaking how he observes the changes of narrative of Russia propaganda 2 weeks a week before the elections in Russia. His name is Stephen Hunchings. He is a professor at the University of Manchester, and even my Russian colleagues say he is one of the best. So you will get the information. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.